What's up, everybody? Welcome to Wednesday Night Live. Tonight we are concluding our summer mini-series on the Beatitudes, these countercultural sayings of Jesus in Matthew chapter 5 about what it looks like to live blessed, happy, and at peace. And as crazy as some of what Jesus says sounds, like it's blessed to mourn, or blessed to be meek, or be poor in spirit, he closes with maybe the craziest statement of all. I think we can at least wrap our minds around how some of the other things would bring fulfillment, but this one is tougher. In Matthew 5, verses 10 through 12, Jesus says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And then he continues, "Blessed," this word that we've talked about, makarios, happy, fulfilled, completely at peace. "Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." Whew! I don't know about you guys, but I hear those words and I think that does not sound blessed at all. Persecution seems hard and heartbreaking. And also, to be honest, it doesn't seem super tangible. It feels kind of foreign to my own experience. Like, unless somebody disagreeing with you on Facebook counts as persecution, right? But what Jesus is describing here is a reality for many of his followers across the globe. Like, exact statistics regarding persecution are kind of impossible to collect since so much of it occurs in the developing world, but it's estimated that over 200 million Christians in at least 60 countries are routinely denied fundamental human rights solely because of their faith. And that over 150,000 Christians are killed every single year because they're following Jesus. Like, persecution against Christians is one of the largest human rights violations issues in the entire world today. And again, that doesn't really feel real to us living here in the United States, does it? I just personally don't have a frame of reference for it in my own life, and I doubt that any of us do, or many of us do. But I do think we understand what it's like to be dismissed for being Christians. Not necessarily persecuted or not experiencing violence, but being dismissed. We don't fear for our lives every day, but we do live in a culture that has increasingly rejected Christianity and become more and more hostile towards Christians. And my sense is that that trend will continue in the direction it's headed now, which causes a lot of Americans, like a lot of comfortable privileged Christians in the Western world, to say things and honestly believe things like, Jesus is definitely coming back soon. I just think Jesus' return is near if we're going to be in a spot where the government bans us from publicly sharing our faith. I know Jesus is coming back soon before we have to suffer. I can't believe he wouldn't come back if our faith is going to be outlawed or we're going to be muzzled by the government. Right? We hear that. I've heard that. But you guys, that doesn't seem to be what Jesus says at all about when he's coming back, or honestly, what even concerns him. In fact, his words in Matthew 5 here suggest he's not only unworried about the possibility of us being persecuted for our faith, he actually expects that we will be, just like he was. And he says we will be blessed when that happens, which is pretty crazy. He says, blessed are the persecuted. Blessed are you. You should rejoice when you're persecuted on account of righteousness. And what does he mean by that? What's righteousness here? Because that matters. You're not blessed when you're persecuted for being a jerk or being insensitive or as a result of your own poor choices. Like, not every instance of suffering in everyone's life results in blessing. Only suffering for righteousness' sake on account of Jesus is blessed, according to this beatitude. And that could be easy to miss, but it's important to understand it because we often do things that bring suffering into our lives. And too many of us want to do that and then blame the world around us for persecuting us, when really we're just living out the consequences of the dumb things we chose to do and the dumb people we chose to be. And Jesus is getting at something different here. And we know that because of two statements that mean essentially the same thing. When he says, for righteousness' sake and on my account. Righteousness' sake and Jesus' account mean the same thing. They mean right living for the sake of Jesus because you have a relationship with him. So blessed are you when you get put down, rejected, made fun of, or made to suffer because you're living for Jesus in the way he calls you to live. This blessing is for people who suffer because the world rejects them for running after Jesus with everything they've got. But why in the world would the world do that? I mean, the things that Jesus is asking us to do throughout the rest of the Beatitudes seem like things the world would embrace, right? Being humble, loving, peaceful, merciful, and pure. That all kind of sounds like a good way to be. And it is. But you guys, it isn't a way that society is always going to celebrate. Because living like that comes into conflict with the mindset of the world. There's a natural and unavoidable conflict between the selfish and sinful mindset of our culture and the selfless mindset of Jesus Christ. Jesus highlights that in Luke 16 when he has this interaction with the Pharisees. He tells them, you guys cannot serve two masters. You cannot love both God and money. And they kind of scoff at him and ridicule him because they love money. And they try to justify loving money because that's what the world does. And that's what every single one of us does all the time, just not always with money. We try to justify loving the things of this world. We try to make excuses for all the stuff we've placed in the spot only God should be. But in Luke 16, when Jesus talks about money that way, to the Pharisees, it felt like an attack on their love of money, an attack on their lifestyle. And that's the reality we're all going to face if we bring Jesus' teachings through our lives to the world around us. Like if we devote our lives to purity, our culture will see it as an attack on their idol of free sex. If we devote our lives to self-control, our culture will see it as an attack on their habit of self-indulgence. Like in the same way, our humility will insult their pride. Our compassion will insult their selfishness. Our honesty will insult their lies. Like our very lifestyle will be an affront to the culture in which it's lived. And that culture will hate us for it. Jesus promises us that. Like the world's going to hate us for living like him, just like it hated and killed the Christians who came before us. The world is never going to embrace Christians who actually look like Jesus, because living like Jesus is a counter-cultural way to live. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a Lutheran pastor when Hitler and the Nazis rose to prominence in Germany. And while the vast majority of Lutheran ministers and churches sat by and did nothing, or worse yet, supported Hitler and propped him up, Bonhoeffer resolutely refused. He stood against the evil in his world. He refused to be silent or bow down to the Nazis, and he ended up getting killed in a concentration camp for it. But before he died, Bonhoeffer, from his position of rejection and suffering and affliction, wrote this. And I think it expresses the reality of persecution quite nicely for all of us today. He said, discipleship, following Jesus, right? Discipleship means allegiance to the suffering Christ. And it is therefore not at all surprising that Christians should be called upon to suffer. I think Bonhoeffer's observation is particularly powerful because it highlights something important. Namely, Jesus suffered, which is really encouraging for us because it means we can trust his promise. Jesus isn't just some guy who's making predictions or trying to come up with wise, pithy little sayings, but never really experiencing what he's talking about. And he isn't just some pampered philosopher who's telling us how things should be without ever dealing with the real world. Instead, this promise he makes, that those who suffer for the sake of righteousness will be blessed, comes from somebody who suffered greatly. I mean, literally, the night he was arrested, Jesus was in such agony over the idea of taking on the sins of mankind, which were directly in conflict with his character as God. He was so broken over the idea of separation from his Father that his body went into shock and he was sweating blood. Then he got beaten raw by a whip. He had thorns pressed into his skull. He got nailed to a cross. Like as a perfect and sinless God, he had to take all of our sins upon himself and experience separation from the Father, separation from his own self and his own character. Jesus suffered. And it's from his position and experience of suffering and his understanding of the richness of the blessing that comes along with it, that Jesus promises us suffering for his sake, suffering for living the way we were made to live brings blessing. Like he's tasted a reality we've never glimpsed, and so we can be confident that his promise is true. Those who suffer because they're willing to live for him will be blessed richly and beyond measure. And that said, I think it's important to answer this question. If Jesus tells us we're blessed when we're persecuted for living rightly, does that mean he wants us to be persecuted? That it's God's will for us to experience pain and suffering and rejection? If God really loves us, why would he want that? Well, here's the answer. I want you guys to believe it to the core of who you are. God hurts for our hurts. and it breaks his heart when we suffer. That's the reason he created space for us to live eternally with him, so that we wouldn't ever have to experience pain again. He loves us so much, he feels it when we're cut down. So much he was willing to bleed and die for you and me. And even though in his power he could prevent all the pain and the persecution and the suffering and the sorrow that we experience in this life, he doesn't. And he doesn't do that because he created humans with free will. He made us with the ability to make choices so that we could truly experience relationship with him, so we could know what love really is, so that we're more than robots who simply do what a divine puppet master makes us do. And sometimes as a dad, I think it'd be nice if my kids were robots and I could control them. Like, do the dishes, clean your room, go to sleep immediately. But I wouldn't have a real relationship or a real love in my interactions with my kids if that was the case. And the same thing's true with God. If he took away our will, we wouldn't be free to love him. And so he gives us freedom. And we, as sinful human beings, use that freedom to do horrible things to one another. And so we experience suffering. And as Christians, we are guaranteed to suffer at the hands of a world full of people who've chosen to reject God. But we know this: God suffers alongside us, and he cares deeply about our pain. And because of that, he doesn't waste our pain. Since brokenness is a reality of our fallen world, he takes our hurts and he uses them to draw us toward himself, to refine us, to point us towards our desperate need for him and his mega love for us. He uses it to call the world to himself. The great Christian writer C.S. Lewis put it this way: God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks to us in our conscience, but shouts in our pain. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. So Jesus promises if we're willing to go out and live for him in the middle of an unbelieving culture, we're going to be rejected by some people. As American Christians, we likely won't be killed for it, but we might be made fun of, looked down on, or excluded. And we will certainly, unquestionably be misunderstood. And the truth is, if we don't experience any of those things, it's probably an indication we aren't actually living like Jesus called us to live. We're not living counterculturally the way that he did. We're just trying to blend in. And Jesus is calling us to something better than that. He's inviting us to a life that stands in bold relief against the backdrop of a broken world, rather than a life that blends in, sells out, and makes no difference. And he promises us that that kind of life will bring rejection. But he also promises us that that kind of life will bring blessing beyond measure. We'll live full of purpose, with eternity in view, and we'll be able to make a difference by standing up and standing out, by living the way that Jesus created us to live, confident that we'll be richly blessed. We'll have the opportunity to write a better story for the people around us, and that is a blessed, happy, fulfilling purpose for which to live.